Okay, we're going to finish up our lesson here on Urbanization of America. This is a continuation of that module. So we're going to go ahead and look at the urban trends in the 20th century. We covered, your first video covered 1800 and 1900, so now we're going to look at the next 100 years, 100 plus years, kind of 1900 to 2000. So let's check out some of these trends. Okay, changes in the city. The 20th century ushered in all these technologies that promoted decentralization and suburbanization. In class, I want you to remind me so that we can talk about what's the difference between a metropolitan area, the central city, and suburbs. How are these areas defined? This would be kind of a recap from your intro to urban studies class. So we're not going to go into it today, but we can talk about that in class if you guys like. Okay, so today the suburban population is larger than the urban population, the central city population, these non-metropolitans, all these populations combined. The suburban population is the biggest one. So that's where we're at. So these decentralizing technology, as I said in this lesson, we're going to kind of focus on technology. The car, the automobile was a game changer in the life of cities. So we had the invention of the automobile plus mass production of this Model T. That's a picture right there of Henry Ford's Model T. So just to kind of in your head get an idea of this trend, in 1915 there were 5 million automobiles. By 1930, just 15 years later, there was 25 million. So really the first great period of suburbanization occurred in the 1920s. And it wasn't just the personal automobile. It wasn't just like this picture, this guy driving his Model T. Think about the idea of trucks, like these big trucks that we see on highways all the time now. They freed firms from having to be near the railroads. Before railroad transportation, you had to be right there by the tracks. But with trucks, retailers could then follow their customers, and they could follow, and then manufacturers could follow the labor force instead of the other way around. So this really led to manufacturers, to people kind of leaving central cities for more suburban areas. Communication technology was another big factor. So this improved telephone communication, it decreased the need for face-to-face interactions. Cities are definitely sites for this face-to-face social human interaction. This picture over here is a 1930s telephone operator. So I know this might have been a job you would have had as a college student in the 1930s, but so improved telephone communication, but also think about movies like motion pictures, commercial radio. This meant that people didn't have to go to central cities for their entertainment. It didn't have to be the only place you could get entertainment. And then the first highways were completed in 1926. And it backfired a little bit, this plan, because you've heard of a parkway, like a highway, a freeway, a parkway. Well, parkways were supposed to give the urban middle class access to the countryside. Because if we talked about the earlier cities as being a place of just the built environment, not a lot of green space, not a lot of recreation space, they're like, okay, well, let's build these parkways so that the urban middle class could go to the countryside. They could go kind of get away from the city a little bit. But instead, what happened, the reason I said it backfired is because the outcome was that it actually made it easier to live in the suburbs and work in the city. So just a couple of history points to note. There was this whole massive move to suburbanization, but it slowed down a little bit during the Great Depression. That's in the 1930s. And then following the Great Depression, we had the World War II. So like between 1941, 1945, suburbanization slowed down because we were at war. So residential construction halted. Production of the automobile for civilians, that was suspended. Gasoline was rationed. So this kind of suburbanization trend slowed down a little bit, but then after World War II was kind of a huge changing point, a huge turning point in American urban and suburban history. Because after World War II, numerous federal policies generated the move to the suburbs. There was a suburban housing boom. In my urban studies class, I joke about like urban studies really gets interesting after World War II, but it was all these policies that encouraged suburbanization. And so some of these were mortgage financing was readily available. All of a sudden, with your automobiles, there was one automobile for every 5 Americans. Um, And then we had this greatly expanded national highway system. So the National Defense Highway Act of 1956, that's a notable one. I mean, the federal government is um, building highways. They are purposefully subsidizing the move to the suburbs. And then you have all this kind of communications technology, this long distance dialing, television, email, fax machines, social networking. I mean, think about your smartphones and everything we have. Think about how this reduces the need for face to face communication. I mean, even right now, you're sitting in a hybrid class on college. So, this kind of Blackboard hybrid online college classes are reducing the need for face to face communication. So this is actually what we consider a decentralizing force. The microchip, microprocessors, little computers, this low cost, instantaneous transmission of words, data, images, all these kind of technologies play a role in our urban and suburban history. So industries, these big firms, they like to maintain a central city presence, but a lot of the back office work, the data processing, programming, call centers, medical imaging, these are all moved to the suburbs. And then through globalization, they're further moved overseas. But a lot of the functions where this kind of economic activity, it used to have to take place in a central city. Well, not anymore. Those moved out to the suburbs as well. And then just regional trends. I'm sure you guys all know about the Great Migration. Um, Farmers, southern, rural blacks moved up north for better economic opportunities in northern cities. Um, but then we see another trend. I don't know if you guys have thought about this. We have another population distribution shift. One is people are leaving the Frost Belt cities. I think of them as Rust Belt cities. For Sun Belt cities, and this map here shows you kind of a line, like the ones in red. These are your Sun Belt cities. I mean, think about it. It's like people all of a sudden, they want to live in warm, sunshiny Florida instead of freezing cold Detroit. And so this is kind of like a population shift of where the Sun Belt cities are really seeing a rise in population, and the Rust Belt cities are seeing a decline in their population. So this is a trend that has been going on across our nation. And then think about it. You've got, instead of this idea of bedroom communities where people live in the suburbs and work in the city, and that's your commute from the suburb to the city. You're seeing commuting from suburb to suburb. You're seeing people just stay within their suburb. Everything they need is right there, which at that point, it's not really a suburb, it's something else. And we can talk about that in class if you want to. But these are just, think about these kind of big overall trends in the 20th century where people are moving, where people are living, these population shifts. Think about the impact that that might have. Okay, so give me a second, pause. Okay, so we have this idea of shrinking cities. You might hear me say that term. You might hear me talk about cities in decline. These are just some examples of cities that are losing population. So between 1950 and 2000, I'm talking post World War II here. But just in that 50-year span, Buffalo, St. Louis, Cleveland, Chicago, Boston, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, these aren't the only cities. There's more. Baltimore, New Orleans was a city in decline even before Katrina, even though it is more characteristic of a Sunbelt city rather than a Rust Belt city. But still, so not all cities, when you look at them today, are equal, right? There's a lot of different things happening in different cities, but these are regional trends. So this is just an example of cities that have been shrinking, cities that are losing population. So and what this has to do with planning is, before, if urban planning is a response to urbanization, to we have these cities with these growing populations and we're overwhelmed and we have to plan for growth. What are we going to do to accommodate bigger populations of people? Well, the reality is now that cities are shrinking, so they have to plan for smaller populations. And we can talk about that more in the semester. It's actually really difficult to get planners to talk about shrinking cities, to talk about planning for something other than growth. And that's a political part of the planning process as well. But Here's just kind of a list of some shrinking cities or cities in decline for you to consider. And just a couple other trends. I mean, since 2000, poor Detroit is like the biggest loser. And I mean that jokingly. In terms of population, Detroit, massive population loss with the closing of the automobile plants. And then in contrast, you've got something like New York, where New York has emerged as this global city. Population increase. It's a player in the global economy. We're seeing the urbanization of poverty, where cities have become sites for the poor. This is more apparent when you look globally. When you look at cities outside of the US, this is more of your global problem, the urbanization of poverty. Um, but this is also characteristic of cities in the US. And let's discuss what you think about the current condition of cities. Where do you think we are today? And that kind of concludes your lesson on urbanization. And now you can proceed to your class assignments.